The world of the Thousand-Week Reich is a world where World War II would start out the same. We all know the story. Italy and Germany become buddies. Germany annexes Austria and invades Czechoslovakia, then demands Poland gives them some land but gets rejected. So the Germans invade Poland, which makes the British and French join the war, who do basically nothing against the Germans. After the Polish get crushed by their two fronts, the Germans are forced to invade Norway because of the British blockade. Then after that, the Germans invade the Benelux to get into France. But here's where the timeline becomes different. Germany blitzkriegs into France like usual, but there's a problem. Not for the Germans, but for the Allies. The British evacuation of their forces that are trapped at Dunkirk goes wrong and fails, leaving around 200,000 to 300,000 extra Allied men to the Germans. In our timeline, those soldiers got evacuated. With that huge success, the Germans are able to wipe out the French within no time, breezing through Paris and all of France. Now, the British have a choice. Either keep fighting in Africa since Italy has joined the war, or accept their defeat and surrender to the Germans. But because of the failed evacuation at Dunkirk, the civilian majority heavily supported surrendering, and so did the parliament. So right after Vichy France would be created, the British would sign a peace treaty with the Germans, ending the war only within a few months. But the Axis was far from done. In sub-Saharan Africa, the Free French movement would be able to rapidly expand. Meanwhile, Germany would keep their promise with Spain and would give them Morocco, creating great diplomatic relations. I know a lot just happened within a minute and a half, but all you need to know is that the British are out of the war and the Axis is looking real healthy. Besides Italy, they suck. Like usual, the Italians would go ahead and try their luck at an invasion of Greece, which backfires on them. Germany is super not fond of this since they were supposed to invade the Soviets before any other side missions. So the Germans would first go down to Hungary and would pressure them to join the Axis, which they would do. Next was Romania, but there was little pressuring needed since they would join right away. Bulgaria would also join since they saw an opportunity to get revenge from World War I. Yugoslavia would be a bit more complicated, but in the end, they would deny joining. So with all the new members, Germany would blitz into Yugoslavia and then into Greece. With that out of the way, the Axis could return to preparing for the invasion of the USSR. Talking about the Soviets, they were also on their own side quests. After annexing the Baltics, they would invade the Finnish. The war would quickly turn against them, and eventually the Soviets would have to deal with a peace treaty that wasn't what they originally wanted. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the Japanese had invaded China and were becoming a big threat to the British. It would only get worse when the Japanese would take control of French Indochina, meaning the Germans and the Japanese had good relations. The Japanese would expand aggressively into central China from the north. They would reach Nanjing and Shanghai, but would soon be stopped after the Chinese would seriously use their manpower to their advantage. Back to Europe, the Axis were done preparing and the Soviets were far from ready, meaning it was going just accordingly to Hitler's plan. With over 3 million men, the Axis would launch their invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler couldn't care less about the loss of life occurring within the invaded regions. Germany and its allies would bulldoze into Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, encircling outrageous numbers in places like Kiev, Minsk, and Riga. With combined German and Finnish forces, Leningrad would be put in a siege that would last unsufferable years. In the south, Romanian and other Axis forces would sweep against the Soviet army, whose generals could stand no match against the German ones. The only problem for the Axis was that every day that passed, winter got closer, meaning they would have to stop. The Soviets would bring in their Siberian forces to handle the front line for now. So while the war goes to a stalemate for the time being, let's check up on Japan again. Japan wanted one main thing, and that was to be the empire of the Pacific. There was only one problem. The British and Americans heavily ruled the ocean the Japanese wanted to control. So they came up with a plan, and soon enough it would come into action. They would bomb Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, destroying a good part of the American main fleet for the Pacific. The Americans would be forced to join the war against the Japanese. Japan would attack multiple islands in the south, going through the Philippines all the way into Papua New Guinea. Okay, so here's the situation. The European Axis is in a harsh war against the Soviets, who is receiving extreme aid from the Allies. Meanwhile, the British and Americans are in an equally harsh war against the Asian Axis. Both Japan and Germany are winning, and it's not even close. By the June of 1942, the Axis would resume their offensive. Romanian, Hungarian, and German forces would all attack in the south, targeting Stalingrad and the oil in the Caucasus. Multiple battles would end in the Axis reaching the Caspian Sea, splitting the Soviets in two. In Stalingrad, the German and Romanian forces would engage into the city. A tough and bloodshed battle would begin. The Axis would lose around 500,000 men, but the Soviets would lose a whopping 950,000 men to the city that they would eventually lose after a 2-month battle. In Leningrad, the city would be demolished. The Germans would bomb the city to shreds, killing double civilians than soldiers. So after about a year of siege, the city would fall to the joint German-Finnish attack. Hitler would focus on killing out the forces in the Caucasus first, slowly beating them down offensive after offensive. Eventually, all that was left would retreat into Baku that would end after a 6-month siege. Moscow would be the new main objective for the Axis. They would prioritize the center, rushing into Moscow and initiating the most bloody battle in the war yet. The Axis would actually lose less men than they did in Stalingrad, but the Soviets would lose almost 1.3 million men from the main city to the suburbs. As winter would set in, the Germans and their allies would rest and would be set on the defensive once again. The Soviets would now finally try their own great offensive, which would go as expected, horribly. They would push in the center and south, but would lose massive numbers of their men. Hitler thought by now they would unconditionally surrender, but annoyingly, they would keep on brutally fighting. So in the meanwhile, Germany would go on a little side mission down in the Middle East. A meeting in Ankara would consist of the leaders of Italy, Germany, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. All 6 nations would discuss those 4 Middle Eastern countries joining the Axis. Although the war was heavily in the favor of the Axis, almost all 4 nations would decline their invitation to join the alliance. Besides Iraq, who would join the Axis and the war. Their oil would prove to be a big help in the future. And the final major thing the Axis would do in 1943 would be a rather dumb one, but unlike our timeline, it wouldn't really come back to bite them. The Germans, along with their allies, would declare war on the Americans, continuing their strong relation with the Japanese. Talking about Japan, it was clear it was not going well for them recently. In Burma, the British and Indians would be able to push them back steadily. And in Papua New Guinea, the Australians and the Americans would push them almost out of the island. But for now, the Asian Axis would do their best to be on the defensive, fragilely holding on to their huge empire. They would be able to invade China more and connect to Indochina, being one of the few successes they've had. Fast forwarding to the summer of 1944, the Germans would relaunch their offensive into Russia. Because of all the failed attacks the Soviets tried during the winter, they were severely weakened, meaning the Axis would breeze through them. The Soviets would be forced to set their defensive on the river. And to much relief to the European Axis, the USSR would start to experience revolts, mainly in Siberia and Central Asia. The rebellions would be small and usually unorganized, but still, it was showing that the war was soon coming to an end. The only ongoing problem for the Axis was that their supply line kept on getting stretched farther and farther, meaning breaking the newly made defense line by the Soviets was going to be difficult. But luckily for them, they ruled the skies and would daily bomb their defense to dust. According to the treaty with the UK, the British could not fight against the Germans, nor help other countries against the Germans either, meaning the Americans could not land on the Isles to invade France. The treaty also let Hitler have agents in Britain to make sure the rules were not being broken. So the Americans would basically abandon the task of defeating the Germans until 1945, which is when the treaty would expire. So the USA would instead focus mainly on the Japanese. In New Mexico, they would come closer every day to their nuclear bomb, able to wipe out any of Japan's cities. Spies in Tokyo would be able to alert American generals of an incoming naval battle. The Second Battle of Midway would result in another major American win just like the first time. Japanese morale would be on a spiral of plummeting down. In Burma, they would continue to be pushed out until they would basically be pushed out entirely. For every day that passed, Thailand would seem more eager to leave the war, but for now, they would stay under the Japanese thumb. In Papua New Guinea, the Australians would fully take control of the island once again. Plans to invade the rest of Indonesia would take action with multiple landings taking place on different islands. It was becoming very clear to everyone, even the Germans, that Japan had lost their invincibility and was not destined to win their war. In Burma, Japanese forces would retreat because of multiple British attacks on their supply line. Thailand would surrender as soon as they would get invaded, resulting to both the British and Japanese invading the country. Malaysia would be swiftly invaded. Meanwhile, the Americans and Australians would creep up from Indonesia, fully invading Java and landing on Borneo. The Philippines would suffer multiple landings from American troops. The US would liberate half the country. In China, the Allies would be able to push back the Japanese a little in the south, cutting them off from Indochina. But even after all of these events, Japan would still be far from surrendering, and it became clear the Allies needed to do something drastic if they wanted to keep this war from being a total bloodbath. So the Americans would get 2 of their newly made bombs and would drop both on Japan's soil. And shortly after, they would surrender. Japan had lost, and this was a huge blow to its allies in Europe. America would now be able to focus on Germany and possibly help out the Soviets before they collapse. But the revolts from earlier had become bigger and bigger, and it was becoming almost impossible to keep them down. In Siberia, multiple countries would proclaim their independence, and so would some nations in Central Asia. The writing on the wall would be very clear. Stalin and his high officials would desert the country as it would fall apart, fleeing to the Perm government. Germany would establish its last puppet in Russia, marking the end to the German-Soviet War. 2 superpowers just collapsed on both sides, and now it was solely a war between the Axis and Americans. But since both sides knew they couldn't really do much to each other, they would meet in London to declare peace, ending World War II. But that's not where the story ends. The Axis was very dependent on the German economy, which was not a good one. Inflation would skyrocket immediately after the war would end, affecting the entirety of Europe. On top of that, Hitler would fall into a short coma. A man named Henning von Tresckow would overthrow the German government until Hitler would wake back up and defeat him. It would show how unstable the country really is. In the aftermath of the war, the British Empire was severely weakened in terms of stability. All over the world, many of its puppets and colonial territory would secede from the British, marking a new era in colonization. The treaty with the Germans would expire, but Hitler would not make his agents leave the Isles, sparking high tension between the two once again. Tension would especially rise once the Italians would invade British Somaliland. Back in Asia, the Americans would occupy Japan and Korea for now, planning to make both of them democratic nations in the future. Although America did technically win the war in a way, they still had a bad reputation in their own country after they would bomb Japan and then peace with the Germans. Talking about the nukes, the Axis has secretly been spying on the American Manhattan Project and is making their own nuclear bombs in Berlin and Rome. This would only become public information after American spies would reveal it to the government back home. And there it is. Here's where the 1,000-week Reich begins. Almost all nations on Earth are unstable, and World War II ended in a tie, where Japan and the Soviet Union are the 2 losers. And now that you know the lore, go play the mod.